Good evening and welcome to this Guardian live event. I'm Davika Bhatt, Joint Deputy Head of International News at The Guardian, and it's a pleasure to welcome you tonight for our evening's discussion. We'll be together for an hour and 15 minutes and we'll be discussing Saudi Arabia's rehabilitation and its place in the world now. Some of you have sent questions in advance to our speakers. Thank you so much for those. And if you would like to put a question forward at any point, please just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, including who the question is for, if you like, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can in the second part of the hour. If you require closed captions or subtitles, you'll find this icon at the bottom of the screen too. Also, please do excuse my slightly croaky voice. I'm just recovering from a cold. Now, to introduce our panel for tonight's discussion. So first up, we have Safar Al-Ahmad, who is a journalist and filmmaker who has directed documentaries for PBS and the BBC focusing on the Middle East. She has produced Saudi's Secret Uprising, described as a rare documentary showcasing the historically unprecedented protests in the kingdom. The activists featured in the film are either awaiting execution in Saudi prisons or living in exile. Her work on Yemen spans a decade and reflects the bloody trajectory of the conflict within the country and its international impact. And she's received numerous awards for her work and has been Emmy nominated as well. Nasreen Malik is a Guardian columnist and author of We Need New Stories, challenging the toxic myths behind our age of discontent. Barney Ronay is our chief sports writer for The Guardian, and Patrick Wintour is diplomatic editor for The Guardian. And it's great to have you all here tonight, so thank you. So after years of fraught international relations and sort of 5 years after the murder now of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, Saudi Arabia has been on this mission to rehabilitate its global reputation. We've seen this across a number of spheres, from the sort of soft power of Saudi's engagement with global sports and the leisure industries, across to Riyadh's re-engagement with the West and other major countries, diplomatically, politically, and in business and defense. At the heart of this is Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's crown prince and de facto ruler, who, according to US intelligence, himself approved Khashoggi's assassination. Yet, amid Saudi's terrible human rights record, it's clear he's aiming for a complete rehabilitation of his regime. He's met with Biden. I'm sure we all remember that fist bump from last year. He's been to the Elysee and met with Macron. And at some point in the coming weeks, we're expecting him to come to the UK to meet Rishi Sunak. He's positioned Saudi Arabia as a sort of global tourism destination too, and ploughed ahead with various grand plans, including to build a futuristic city in the desert. There is also invariably a link with the horrific events we've seen this week in Israel and Gaza, which will almost certainly have an impact on Saudi's relations in the Middle East. We'll try to talk about all of this tonight. So Nasreen, if I could open with you. So we have all these different spheres in which Saudi is kind of trying to expand its influence and seek rehabilitation. Do you think it is the case, just very broadly, that the world is very much back to business with Riyadh? And could you talk us a bit through the evolution of how we've got here?
Yes, is the short answer. And the slightly longer answer is, I'm not sure how unhabilitated it was in the first place. I think that the time following Khashoggi's murder was very dramatic in terms of sort of media coverage and condemnation, but it wasn't long before people were actually appearing in person in Saudi business conferences. I think that December of that very same year, there was a big investment conference in Saudi Arabia. And so I think the question is, it's not really about rehabilitating Saudi's image. I think Khashoggi was a big event in terms of Mohammed bin Salman's global reputation. But I think what's happening now and what's been happening since is a lot bigger than just coming out of the shadow of that event. It seems like it is a repositioning that has a very long time horizon and is much more strategic. And in a way, the Khashoggi murder seems like something that's overshadowing, or maybe we're kind of seeing things too much through the prism of Saudi's perception of its human rights record in the world. I'm not sure how much it cares particularly about that. And there's been evidence that human rights abuses across the Middle East and indeed the world are usually swept, below the carpet when there's business interests or sports interests, etc. The bigger concern is Saudi's position in the Middle East, Saudi's position as a global player, Saudi's repositioning of its economy, diversifying it, and generally kind of getting with the program as a Gulf state that's come to its liberalization relatively late, liberalization, quote unquote, but we'll get into that, relatively late compared to its peers, Qatar, the UAE, and the kind of geostrategic competition and tension in that neighborhood anyway. So I would suggest that it was never really something that put Saudi out in the cold. The human rights abuses are well known. This was the most high profile one. Executions continue. They get good coverage. They get good human rights organizations criticism. And there are many, many other high profile Saudi human rights activists that have either been thrown in jail, disappeared, kidnapped, and they're very vocal. And so it was never really completely a pariah because of that. And I think what's happening now is a much bigger story.
Thank you, Nasreen. And yeah, and as you sort of say there, the kind of detentions and the executions have sort of continued. Safa, I wonder if you can talk a little bit to that. I mean, this dreadful human rights record, when we talk about that, I think maybe sometimes there's a presumption that people know what that looks like in reality. Whereas, because of the very opaque nature of actually finding out what's going on in Saudi, it's quite hard to know that. And you've obviously done a lot of work in this area. Could you tell us what that looks like in reality, this dreadful human rights record? What is happening now to activists, journalists, anyone who's kind of brave enough to put themselves out there and say they're opposed to the regime in any way?
Yeah, I think I would agree that they were never a pariah state, really. And I would go further, that it was just lip service from the West to seem so shock and horror on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, although the details were horrendous. But the Saudis and the UAE had been committing war crimes in Yemen for 8 years. And so it's the one individual versus an entire country taken to war and decimated. And so I think for a lot of us inside Saudi who are critical of the state, it showed more of the hypocrisy of the West than anything that the Saudis have done to rehabilitate themselves. I was invited to this program just a few weeks ago, and they're like, is this the diplomatic century of Saudi Arabia? And I thought it was really funny because I think media themselves play such a huge role in whitewashing the reputation of Saudi Arabia, because this is the same government that had forcibly got the prime minister of Lebanon to resign in front of a camera under duress. There's so many examples, or what they did with Canada. And so just before I speak about the domestic issues, I think there's so many glaring examples of Saudi Arabian government not caring at all about human rights, even before the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, even before the horrendous executions of 81 people last year, even before they did all of these. There was a track record of how heinous is that Saudi government, that for us, it was like, I think more of showing how hypocritical Western governments are about caring about human rights in the region, and especially on Saudi, about caring about building a democracy in the region. So it just belied all of that stuff. And just talking about Palestine now and talking about respecting civilians, respecting their right to life, if they're Arabs. And so there's an entire narrative that fits into what Arabs deserve. And I will put the Saudis in that bucket of you should be so lucky, right? Oh, Saudi Arabia has now allowed women to drive cars. Oh my God, we've joined the 21st century, and I should be grateful for that. And so there's a whole slew of things that have already been happening in Saudi Arabia, even before the passing of King Abdullah and the taking of power of King Salman, and then the now Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia have taken over. There seems to be short-term memory about what was the record before and the focus on Mohammed bin Salman as an individual, which I find really problematic, because then we're not talking about institutional oppression in Saudi Arabia. We're not talking about the country and the government as a whole entity that is oppressing its people, and not just Mohammed bin Salman. So there's a lot of rhetoric in the West as well in the early days of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, when they were like, well, the problem is him, right? And so if he's removed, then everything's going to be fine in Saudi Arabia. And that's a lie, because it takes away the ability of Saudis to critique the institutions themselves that are oppressing them, regardless of Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman is just the symptom of what's going on inside the country. And so now we're looking at what was oppressive before is now even more oppressive, because they've seen that they can behave with impunity in the outside its borders, but also now even more so inside its borders by giving people sentences for 30 and 40 years for a tweet, for disappearing people, for even things like what we thought wouldn't be possible, like arresting women, torturing women, threatening rape in prison. All of these things that we weren't used to before have now become the norm, right? Because the feminist movement inside Saudi Arabia had gotten so strong that the government is now feeling threatened by them, right? And so all of these examples for me are, do we as Saudis deserve to be heard, deserve to be seen when Saudi Arabia is being covered, right? And so when and I'm going to generalize now about Western media, when they talk about Saudi Arabia, it's as if the Saudi people don't exist. Right? There's only MBS. It kind of reminds me of like Gaddafi in Libya, where Libya is Gaddafi and Gaddafi is Libya, and people don't live there. And so there's a problematic way of how the Saudis are being talked about or erased, actually, when it comes to these things, right? And so this is where the challenge is for me about speaking about what's happening inside Saudi Arabia right now, because we were just saying about the opaqueness. Now, is Saudi Arabia really opaque? It's difficult, right? But media does not make an effort to actually cover Saudi Arabia properly, right? Like, I'm sorry, but just before getting on here, I was like, oh, we don't need to go to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia comes to us. I think that's part of the problem of how badly understood the situation inside Saudi Arabia is, right? So many of the people who write about Saudi Arabia, right, have never been, don't have any understanding. And when they send people to Saudi Arabia, they don't speak Arabic. So they just cover events from their hotel lobbies. And then they wonder, it's like, oh, we don't really understand. You didn't even leave the cities. You have to understand the country and make an effort to understand the country in a deeper way. So then you can be a proper journalist. Do your due diligence, do your actual fact finding, and leave your hotel room. And these things are not happening on Saudi Arabia because it's so easy just to write from the outside, right? And then basically, I think I took more time, but this is one of the things that I find really challenging about talking about Saudi Arabia, because it seems like the Saudis are irrelevant to any conversation when it comes to what is happening in the country. It's like they're irrelevant, they're invisible.
I mean, look, those are very powerfully made points. How do we amend that, especially in the Western media, where things like visas are not going to be easily granted, where any visits have to be, you'll be carefully accompanied by somebody who is going to show you a very select view of the place, which is not going to tell the kind of big story of what Saudi people actually think. How, in that incredibly challenging environment, what can people do, and how do we make it better? How do we bring Saudi voices? How do we? I mean,
your question, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it's such a white gaze on how the region is covered. Well, it's like, oh, we have to fly someone in to cover what's happening inside Saudi Arabia. What I would say quickly is like, you develop people inside the country, develop contacts. There are so many people who go in. I mean, now it's no longer an excuse because you have tourism visas. There's so many different ways of covering. I mean, this question doesn't get asked when it's like Syria, when it's like so difficult to get smuggled in. journalists who want to get a story find a way in, right? And
But
so, yes, all
there are
issues are
about
hard,
safety, aren't
but
there?
it's not impossible.
There are issues about
Sure.
there are issues about safety there. I mean, I know this from my job. There are issues about safety and how you in responsibilities to people within the country. And of course, that's the ideal situation. Of course it is. But you know, again, it's not super straightforward, is it? In terms
No,
of
it's not. But it all depends on whether there's a priority within commissioning editors to say, right, we need to understand Saudi Arabia properly. We're going to invest the resources and we're going to put the people in place so then we can cover things properly inside Saudi Arabia and not have this outside white gaze onto the country that only has very specific ways of understanding and caring about what's happening inside the country, right? Not that some of these views are not valid, but they're not the only views. And just like everywhere else, you're going to miss the bigger story because you've not been talking to everybody on the ground. I don't mean by everybody, but you need to diversify your contacts. I have so many Western journalists who are like, oh yeah, I met Prince so-and-so, and I had a conversation with so-and-so who are of a privileged class, the only that do speak English. And so there isn't a diversity of voices within the coverage itself, right? Even those who manage to come in and the kind of stories that they come out with. I mean, like, I mean, it's I want to say shocking, but it isn't. There are ways, is my short answer. If you want to find ways to properly cover a country, and I mean any country, then you find the resources and the ways to get in.
Thank you, Safa. So, I mean, one of the things we kind of talked about at the start in relation to all of this is the sports issues, which do feel, I mean, I think you're both quite right to point that out, Nesreen and Safa, that this is an ongoing thing. It didn't begin or start with the murder of Khashoggi. But the kind of investment, the kind of really aggressive investment in the sports sort of arena feels more recent or relatively recent. Barney, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. We did our own sort of investigative work a few months ago and sort of, you know, got to this figure of over 6 billion on investments that have been spent on kind of sporting endeavours and sports deals. And in football in particular, this has just been very striking because of the big names, Newcastle and all these kind of players, you know, going over and being bought up for obscene amounts of money. Is this just a kind of bitter pill that sort of fans have to swallow? Or is this the way that, you know, sports is going?
Well, it's undoubtedly something that is going to keep on happening and that people will simply have to adjust to and absorb and make what they want to. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, why is sport in this picture at all is an interesting question. I mean, I cover tennis, football, rugby, and golf, and but the fact is, sport is the global popular culture now, isn't it? It's sort of crowded everything else out, and it's this incredible kind of tannoy to broadcast yourself across these things. And kind of really noticed it at the Russia World Cup in 2018 was the first time we're very slow in our industry to kind of wake up to this. And 2018, there was this incredible tableau of Mohammed bin Salman, Gianni Infantino, who's the head of FIFA, and Vladimir Putin sat together at the Russia-Spain game, which I just happened to be covering, and everybody looking at them in the stands, and the entire kind of television coverage focused on this tableau, which was basically, that was what the World Cup was about. That was why it was staged, really. It's a way of projecting yourself. So sport finds itself dragged into this, and Saudi is, you know, really investing so much in this, in just a mind-boggling fashion. I mean, essentially they bought golf. Golf now basically belongs to Saudi. I think they're trying to buy tennis. Newcastle United has been a massive success. I mean, it's been an incredible thing. What happens when you buy, I don't know if this was ever intended. I mean, the first state to buy an English football club was Abu Dhabi buying Manchester City. And there was this incredible unexpected bonus of, within a couple of weeks, you acquire this online army of fans and kind of, you know, unpaid trolls who will get on Google, research your foreign policy and get out there kind of whacking every single mole, whoever. I remember there was the issue of the spy, well, you know, alleged spy, Matthew Hedges, shortly after well, actually about 8 years after City had been bought by Abu Dhabi. And there was this extraordinary thing of hundreds of middle-aged men, presumably in Manchester, on Twitter, defending, Emirati foreign policy against, journalists, because that's what happens in sport. It's intensely tribal, and it kind of just drowns everything else out. And it's a brilliant way of projecting yourself. I mean, it's very interesting for me to hear what Safa was saying about the way Saudi is covered outside the country, because this is exactly, I think, the intention, to project these personalities and to project this idea and to distract. And we talk about sports washing. This is a word that was coined by Amnesty, of talking about sport as a way of washing the blood from your hands. And it always seems a little, I don't really like the word because it seems too mild. Washing sounds like something quite gentle. But one of the things we really noticed around the Qatar World Cup was that nobody they really care. It is a very Western idea to imagine that here are some people who are trying to make us like them or think that their morality is vaguely similar to ours. And I don't really think that's what's going on. Qatar, seemed to me more about hard power, not soft power, and regional visibility. And we didn't at any stage feel anyone was really persuading us to ignore the human rights problems towards the end. It was a really, really successful propaganda coup using sport that really powerfully sort of positioned Qatar in the region. And it wasn't nothing was being washed. There was nothing apologetic about it. I went to the city of Lusail, built for the tournament, which is an extraordinary place with air-conditioned streets and incredible sort of a mini Rimini and a mini Paris, which is also empty. The idea is that this will become a destination for the international rich. And I think lots of Chinese and Indian people are already buying properties there. And you've basically built something that wasn't there, based around this vast sporting amphitheatre where they had the World Cup at its centre. And it's not sports squashing or anything gentle like that. It's a sort of really impressive act of nation building that sport is just a little mirror to. Sorry, there's me going on about sport, but I'll pass it over to someone else.
Thanks, Barney. No, that was a very good kind of an impassioned sum up of the state of play. Patrick, turning to you, the re-establishment of relations between Arab nations and Israel was one of the kind of big diplomatic changes of the last few years, sort of process that sort of got going with the Abraham Accords under Trump, and the icing on the cake, in inverted commas, of that was supposed to be the Saudis and Israelis kind of signing, reestablishing relations. And Netanyahu and Biden were sort of boasting about this moment being imminent just a few weeks ago at the White House. Obviously, things this week have now sort of really kind of changed the situation regarding that. Do you want to just talk us through what that looks like now and where you think we are on this? And secondly, and more broadly, how do you think kind of the Saudi government is trying to position itself in terms of its sort of diplomatic and political position in the world?
Yeah, just on the first, there's always a danger that as soon as you try to explain why you think a terror group like Hamas has done something, you are going to be justifying it, and I'm not. It is totally horrific and callous and brutal and wrong in every sense. But to extent you can look for a motive other than blind anti-Semitism, I think, and you can be over-rationalistic about it. There is a concern amongst, say, Hamas and some of the Palestinian groups that if Saudi Arabia does come to a kind of arrangement with America and Israel, that would be the nail in the coffin for the whole Palestinian cause. It's difficult to determine whether that is the exact motive for why this happened now or in the form that it did. But I think it's part of the thinking that's going on. Because although Biden started his period in office as very much trying to disengage from the Middle East, he's been, like many other presidents, drawn into it, partly through Ukraine and oil prices, and then through a sense that the way to have a kind of legacy or a kind of policy in the Middle East was actually to develop what Trump had done, which was to try to develop this normalization between Gulf states and Israel. And the big prize in that would always be Saudi Arabia. That would be the kind of absolute mega deal of the century. And so there is this very elaborate diplomatic dance underway in which, from having been moved to a position where they're the pariah state, they're now quite close to being offered access to civil nuclear power, 17 nuclear power stations, and maybe access to the enrichment of uranium. And then, secondly, they will be given a defense treaty that would be almost equivalent to being inside NATO. It'd be NATO minus, i.e. that if Saudi Arabia was under attack, there would be an obligation by America to come to its defense. And in further, they would then have access to Israeli technology. So that is a huge, huge prize. And what is not so clear, and what I think what's at play is really the extent to which Saudi Arabia would say there has to be a price in this, also that there has to be an Israeli consent to a future for the Palestinians, and how definitive that would be is really unclear. And I think most people would now say, as a result of what's happened in the last week, the possibility of Saudi Arabia coming to that kind of deal is certainly been maybe not put off the table forever, but it's been deferred. And all that you can hear from the Saudis that they've said since the attacks is that Israel must bear also responsibility for some of this, in the sense that, not in the sense of what's happened in the last few days, but in the sense that there's been an unwillingness to be serious about a two-state solution. And there are noises inside the European Union that feel the same, that they feel that this idea that you can strike these normalization agreements, they're not a substitute for actually solving the Palestinian issue. And so I think that's sort of the kind of big politics of what's happened over the last few days. There's just a couple of other points about what people have been saying earlier. One was, I think one of the reasons that the Khashoggi thing became as big as it did was because at that time, obviously this happened in Turkey, and at that time, Turkey was at odds with Saudi Arabia, and they started leaking material to the West about what they obviously had bugs in the Saudi consulate, and so they actually knew what was going on. I don't know whether they had more than audio, but they certainly had audio. So that's slightly, and it was clear that Turkey was sort of running a campaign against Saudi Arabia at the time. There is now a change in the relationship between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. So if anything as horrific as that happened again, I don't think you get the same kind of exposure. And then the other point I would make, just about, say, I think people are talking about this is the human rights issue. I think Britain has always been pretty unwilling to take this as very seriously. I saw a British ambassador to former British ambassador to Saudi Arabia called John Jenkins, who's on the circuit quite a bit, and he was at the Conservative Party conference talking at the Conservative Middle East Council event, and he was effectively saying, look, Saudi youth is what matters, and Saudi youth is not interested in democracy. They're not interested in human rights. They are interested in what he would describe as security, and that's their only concern, and that's all we have to be really exercised about. And that, okay, there's organisations like Amnesty getting in a fuss about this, but the pursuit of democracy in the Middle East is a mirage, and look what happened in Iraq. It's not what I think or myself, but it's just what he said. And I think he's a very, why he's interesting is he's quite frank, and I think he's actually a lot of politicians will skirt around it and pretend they say, well, we have raised human rights in private with the Saudis, stroke Iranians, stroke Iraqis, or whoever. But the reality is they don't push it very hard. Sorry, I spoke too long.
Thanks, Patrick. Not at all. Everyone's full of apologies for speaking. Please don't apologize. We're here to hear your views on this. Nasreen, we know also that Saudi has big financial ties with, various corporations in the US, but also in other countries. Just today, we have a kind of Guardian US investigation out into kind of working conditions at the Gulf locations of major US and UK brands, including Amazon, McDonald's. There are allegations of labor abuse and trafficking of workers. I strongly recommend reading it if you haven't already, to everyone out there. But just sort of more broadly, could you talk about the kind of corporate ties that Saudi has either been building or has already had and has been kind of growing on?
Yeah, I think this is something we haven't touched on so far because it's so obvious, right? Is that undergirding all of this is money, right? And because it's so obvious, it didn't occur to anyone, to any of us, until sort of half past the hour to mention it, because it's just understood. The reason why Saudi Arabia has the status is it because it has infinite amounts of money, and it has therefore infinite ways of influencing people into doing its bidding. And there's sort of it's money and oil, but the oil begets the money. So it's kind of the same thing. And it's sort of two ways in which I think the story of Saudi, and the story of the greater Middle East, actually, the greater Gulf, is about financial interests or corporate interests intersecting with a very sort of, I would say, racist at worst and reductionist at best view of what makes these countries tick. And so they're seen as sort of economic power players with inert populations that are not interested, as Patrick just said, in democracy, or not sophisticated enough to understand democracy. And I think the wealthier a country is, the more likely that view is going to influence policymaking, because citizens are seen as wealthy and coddled. And, their rights are seen as secondary to their economic rights. This does not reflect the fact that actually inside there is a huge amount of disenfranchisement and poverty, depending on who you are and what sector you're from and what part of the country you're from. And so those two intersections then play out in two ways financially. One is Saudi Arabia trying to capture sports, popular sport, and now tourism / entertainment. And the second thing is corporate connections. I mean, Saudi, the sovereign wealth funds ownership of American stocks is huge. I mean, they own they own shares in Meta, in Google, in Uber, in Salesforce, PayPal, Amazon, Microsoft, Costco, BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase. And that's just kind of off the top of the list that I just jotted down earlier. And these are, 2-3% stakes, sometimes 1.5% stakes, a lot larger in Twitter since Elon Musk took it over. But what it does then achieve is the presence of these influences and powers in boardrooms, in the sort of general economic power plays that happen in corporate environments. And then there's an analog to that in the UK, which has less investment in FTSE 100 or corporate entities, but does own large parts of the sports infrastructure, Newcastle United, etc. And I think people really underestimate it, like how powerful that is. It's not just about having a passive investor that is there because they're looking to make a profit or looking to diversify. And I think Saudi is treated very much as that sort of passive investor in a way that kind of we have not learned from the lessons of Qatar. I mean, Qatar began doing this a long time ago. The Qatar Investment Authority has been investing for the past 20 years, and PIF, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, is catching up. And once that really begins to gather momentum, then you're into real estate, which Qatar owns a lot of in the UK and particularly London. You're into restaurant holdings. You're into kind of the infrastructure of Western cities, and general kind of high profile, high status stakes in these countries. The business of politics and getting people to understand human rights abuses and dynamics on the ground is complicated enough without this kind of thumb on the scales. And so I actually have a very pessimistic view, which is that, like, to begin with, there is very little moral interest, and there is very little genuine concern about what goes on in large parts of the Arab world, particularly in wealthy Gulf countries. When you add to that these sorts of financial relationships, then it becomes a disincentive, actually. It doesn't just neutralize the moral imperative, it actually disincentivizes the moral imperative to do something about it. And there is no answer. There is no answer to these sorts of really profound, embedded corporate financial relationships. It becomes about the economy. It becomes about, the stability of the stock market. It becomes about real estate prices, house prices, etc. Not to say that, Gulf countries in general, or Saudi in particular, has this sort of tentacle-like presence in Western economies. I'm not saying completely that, but I'm saying something towards that. And once you're in that environment, it becomes very difficult to try and envisage a way in which there can be any sort of consensual pressure put on Saudi Arabia, because there's just no interest in it. Like I said, a disincentive to do that. I don't think I've spoken too long. I've actually kept it short.
Well, I'm about to ask you to speak again, because I want to sort of draw you on the sort of other side of that, I guess, the sort of what's going on in Saudi itself, in terms of kind of big projects. And, you referred to infrastructure. You've written about this big mega kind of future city, NEOM. And I actually, without wanting to embarrass you, I'd love to just read a fantastic way. You just put it in a very kind of apposite way in your piece about this. There is no more transparently profligate projection of an invented national story than that being erected in the northwest of Saudi Arabia. NEOM is Saudi's rebranding in physical form. Could you tell us a bit more about that? I mean, it's just it's just kind of quite an extraordinary idea, really, isn't it, in of itself? And speak to some of those things you were talking about.
Yes, I mean, I have to admit, before I start talking about this, that this is a personal obsession of mine, and I think it is a Western media obsession, NEOM. Not to say that it's not significant and interesting, but I do think it's mostly symbolic, actually. I don't think that it reflects something profound about Saudi society, or the changes in Saudi society. I mean, there are important points about relocating people on NEOM ground, reports of assassinations and coercions of people who settled in that area. But I think NEOM in general is a projection. And if our viewers are not aware of what NEOM is, it's like a sci-fi project, essentially. It's sort of this like hugely ambitious project that is entirely targeted in terms of branding to the West. That's what I find most interesting about NEOM. And it reflects the fact that Saudi's repositioning is about sort of skimming these buzz concepts that make Western journalists and op-ed writers like myself, who are sort of Westernized, think this is very interesting because it reflects the sort of modernization of the primitive desert person becoming sentient via adoption of Western technology, of adoption of like renewable energy, diversity, being at one with nature. So that why I find it particularly fascinating and why I think the symbolism of it is important is because it reflects as an architectural project that kind of has no purpose, really. It's kind of a place that its sort of expressed purpose is to become a sort of research hub, and also house people if they want to live in the northwest of Saudi Arabia because the weather is good and it's kind of an interesting place to live. So it doesn't really have a particularly clear purpose. But what does make it interesting, just to go back to how I started, is that it reflects the sort of credulousness of the West. It reflects the readiness of the West to pick up this narrative of Saudi Arabia changing, and Saudi Arabia embracing its ethos, and its aesthetic and its language. And the bedrock of that is Saudi Arabia's nominal social liberalization. So I think, women driving, people being able to hold open air concerts, cinemas opening, all the stuff that to people who know Saudi is really bewildering that it's happened so quickly. That all underwrites on a superficial level this projection to the West that we're not the bad guys anymore, and we have actually followed the process of modernization as you would imagine a primitive Arab state to embrace. We're not doing it in our own way. We're not kind of merging Arab and Western culture. NEOM symbolizes a sort of, I think, slightly patronizing con, that if we just, stick a projection of a moon, have some birds flying around, talk about how it's all made out of renewable energy, even though you had to pump tons and tons of water into the desert to build it, then the West will credulously swallow this as a symbol of Saudi's emergence into the modern age. And it's just kind of the scraping of the sort of aesthetics and the language and the symbolisms of modernity rather than the values and the ethos and the moralities of modernity, whatever they are. We're not going to get into that. So this is the third aspect of the sort of cultural repositioning, which has also happened. I keep repeating this because I think it's important to understand that this remodeling of Saudi is happening after other countries in the Gulf have done the same and made mistakes and spent loads of money on huge white elephants and duplications of museums and American and British educational institutions like the Louvre, like departments of Ivy League universities, American universities opening up in the UAE and in Qatar. And it's trying to kind of emulate and catch up. How do you get to this place where you are a Dubai or a Doha, where you maintain the status quo, you maintain the power calibrations, you maintain all the oppressions and the human rights calculations that make sure that politically nothing has to change, but you do just enough in terms of social liberalization, and you do a lot more in terms of changing the face, the sort of physical and cultural face of the place, to entice the West to accept you and incorporate you into the global community. And that's what NEOM symbolizes.
Thanks, Nesrine. Just kind of incredible thing, really. Safa, you talked at the start about Yemen and the heavy involvement of Saudi there. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And Patrick, I wonder if you can also talk about that afterwards.
Can I just respond to a few points before I get into Yemen, because that's a whole different kettle of fish. But just to respond to Patrick's comment on the security and the use are only interested in security from the ex-diplomat. I think it's really quite telling, and it ties in my understanding actually of what's happening with Hamas and Israel, and how Saudi is not going to be able to really sign anything substantial that means anything on the ground, right? And so all the Arab governments that have signed peace agreements with Israel have now fallen apart, because not actually within the governments, but all the people in those countries do not believe in normalization with Israel. And Saudi Arabia is definitely one of those countries as a people that do not believe in this normalization. So what's happening now in the past few days is showing that the people and their governments are so separated. And so the US government focusing on getting the Saudi government to sign something with Israel will actually mean nothing on the ground. And if you talk to anyone in Egypt, in Jordan, in any of in Bahrain, in the UAE, in Sudan, yes, of course, in Sudan, nobody's going to tell you that we are happy with normalization with Israel. What they're going to say is going to be out of fear of the government's repercussions on them if they say anything against their policies, right? And so to me, it's more wishful thinking of the US government and the Arab governments themselves that don't give a shit about their people's opinions, right? And so those agreements will happen, and especially in Saudi, not because they give a shit about Palestinian rights or the ability to have a state of their own. And I don't know if even this two-state solution is a viable thing anymore at all. But besides that, I think there is a schism between the two and an understanding that the governments don't represent the people. And this is something that the US and the UK government is actually convenient for them because they have one strong man in each one of these countries that they can agree with on something, sign it, and then they're done. And they think, oh, we've made peace in the Middle East. That actually means jack shit on the ground, to be quite frank. And especially in this week to talk about what's going on in Palestine and the atrocities that are happening there and be so myopic about what that actually means to the people on the ground. I think it is a disservice to anybody who's listening to this that these signed agreements actually mean something and they don't. And this is going back to also connecting it to the money and the weapons, because I think weapons is also one of the bigger things that the Saudis are able to cajole Western governments because of how much money they are spending on these things that they can't defend themselves with, and they'll still ask for the US help when shit hits the fan, right? But all of that says that these Western governments are more than happy to take Saudi money, right? As they know that they're committing human rights atrocities in Yemen, as they know that they're oppressing their own people, right? Because that is easier than dealing with democracies. It's the wishful thinking of this diplomat that only the youth care about is security because that makes it easier to deal with the people in the Arab world, right? Like, I'll give you a simple example of the film I made for the BBC a few years ago on the uprising in the eastern province of Saudi, right? Nobody wanted to cover that story. Very few people covered that story. And I'm talking across the board. As all of the Arab world was on fire and the protests everywhere, very few people actually bothered to cover what was going on the ground and the protests that were happening inside Saudi Arabia. Because the narrative that they wanted to carry is Saudi Arabia, governments, anti-revolution. Right? And what they're doing in other states. They didn't want anybody to cover what was actually happening inside Saudi Arabia itself. And there were massive protests in different parts of the country, and nobody wanted to bother to go there to find out what these people wanted because it went against the narrative of they just want security, that people in Saudi Arabia are rich and lazy and they don't actually want to work, and all the tropes that you're going to get that Nasreen mentions. And so all of that, it leads to also taking Saudi Arabia off the hook because it's so convenient and easy to give them that kind of impunity and say, well, no, actually, this is what their people want. I did this interview with the BBC actually just after King Abdullah passed, and there's a woman before me who was talking about how she was such close friends with so many of the royals in Saudi Arabia and how they are so open-minded and liberal. And it was just the people who are backwards. And this is why they couldn't open up more and be more liberal, because the people, right? They're the ones who are taking them back and they're the ones who didn't want to. And it's such a crazy idea to me that the government that had absolute control and of the security of Saudi Arabia, right? Blaming the people for not being able to move, to liberalize, and the fact that all of a sudden They're able to allow women to drive after they said that all hell was going to break loose and Saudi Arabia will never recover from women driving and there will be no virgins in Saudi Arabia anymore, which is one of the things that they said, if women were allowed to drive, right? But lo and behold, nothing happened in Saudi Arabia when women were able to drive. It wasn't Armageddon, right? And they were able to do all of these things along with it. There are the superficial liberalizations of Saudi Arabia, along with extreme oppression, right? And so please go and have your parties and enjoy your time and have fun, but don't talk about politics. Don't be critical of the state. Don't say anything about Aramco or the restructuring of the Saudi economy, because then you're going to be disappeared, put in jail, and never seen again, and executed and being accused of being a terrorist. And so all of these things together need to be understood. And I'm getting to Yemen. It's going to take a while. But all of these things are part and parcel why this ability of the West to just say that the Saudis don't care about any of these things, right? Because even if you go to Saudi, nobody's going to be able to be critical of the Saudi regime, right?
I totally take your point, but we're going to have to move on to questions soon, and I am keen to hear your thoughts.
Yes.
So if I could encourage you to move on to that, I'd be very grateful so we can get to the audience questions.
Okay, so what part about Yemen war did you want me to do?
Well, I just wanted to, it was about Saudi's, what that looks like right now. With, you know, and we were obviously talking about the arms trade before. We didn't get into a huge amount of detail about that, but that's obviously part and parcel of the equation when you're talking about selling arms to Saudi. Where does it ultimately end up? And obviously, you know, and again, we talked quite a lot in this discussion tonight about media coverage and things, but, you know, Yemen is one of those, it's an incredibly tragic what's happening there, but hasn't really been on the front pages for a very long time. So it would be quite good to have a reminder from yourself and Patrick about this.
That's a great segue into my most hated phrase that media love to use on the war. It's like the forgotten war. And I always ask us, like, who forgot it? Because I don't think the Yemenis forgot about this war. It's the commissioning editors of newspapers that forgot to cover this war. And so,
thanks. So can you?
Yes, I am telling you about it now.
Great.
So we are now in the 8th year of the war in Yemen. And what this has shown, I think what the Saudis were hoping is that they're going to go in, wage war with a coalition, including the UAE, and it will be a quick win within a few months. They would have kicked out the Houthis of all the areas of Yemen that they had captured, and that will be that, and they'll put back the so-called elected government of Yemen, right? What has happened is 8 years on, they have not been able to do any of that. And the Houthis, who they claimed were terrorists, are now on the negotiation table with the Saudis, without the Yemeni government, without the UAE, to try to find a way for the Saudis to get out of this war, right? And so the total miscalculation of the Saudis on what this war would look like for them, and how it would be a quick win for MBS, because MBS at the beginning, remember, this is King Salman had just become king. Mohammed bin Salman had just become Minister of Defense. And so I think there was a perception that this is going to be a quick win for him to establish his reputation, because nobody knew who he was. And what ended up happening is a complete disaster for the Saudis, let alone the human rights disaster of the war inside Yemen. And so what is happening now is a very strange detente where there's light skirmishes on the ground, and unknown negotiations, because there are only the Houthis and the Saudis involved in these negotiations. None of the other parties are involved in it. And I think they will find a way out, but this will mean that there is continued civil war inside Yemen, that is funded by the different factions on the ground by the Saudis and the UAE. But then they can say, hey, we're out of the war, we're not involved. Just like in Sudan, you know, where the different factions, one is supported by the Saudis, one is supported by the UAE, but then they can pretend like they have clean hands and they're not involved, so then they can continue making these business agreements, and it makes it more palatable for the West to say, well, Saudi Arabia has now ended this war. And I'll leave it there. I'm sure Patrick has more to say, but it's a huge topic. I don't think we can
Patrick,
talk about it 5
turn
minutes.
to you and ask you your quick view, and then we'll go to audience questions.
Okay, I can't do justice to this, but I mean, I spent part of my time at the UN General Assembly on the 34th floor of a New York hotel speaking to the President of the Southern Transitional Council of Yemen, probably sent over an interview that was read by about 2 people, but it was, the only point I'd make is that I think what matters is that there is actually an internal, genuine civil war inside Yemen that is not, it's because everyone just says this is sort of proxy powers from outside. There's actually internal disputes which are quite historical. And what is true is that the Saudis are trying to get out as much as they can, but the United Arab Emirates, which support the separatist Southern Transitional Council, are still trying to make sure that they get access to ports in Yemen, whatever peace settlement is signed. And now there's a dispute about if there is oil money, how much goes to the Houthis in the north, and then who pays for a large number of civil servants who haven't been paid anything whatsoever. And it is true what you were saying, that a lot of the participants to this civil war are completely excluded from the negotiations that are being conducted in Riyadh. Is completely bizarre that basically now the Saudis have shut down negotiations so that they're holding direct talks with the Houthis, who are this sort of reviled Iranian-backed group. And if they can, they will do a deal with them, and as long as they feel their own borders are safe. And the whole sense is that this war has been a political disaster for the Saudis. Anyway, I could. All I mean is that I think there's a lot of internal. This has an internal dynamic, this war, which people don't really appreciate from the outside as much, and they tend to sort of purely view it as kind of proxy war, which is being conducted by the Saudis and the Iranians in the West. So I therefore think it's hard to end it.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Okay, well, let's go to some of your questions. Thank you so much for those. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions if you would like to. So we've got some great questions already. And in fact, one of these speaks to something you were talking about earlier, Nesrine, about how Saudi is not the sort of first to do some of the things we've been talking about tonight. And Catherine Fletcher asks, why does the UAE get so little attention when we discuss whether the West is being bought? It is the same poor human rights record as Saudi Arabia, and has arguably been the most successful country to use football for its self-promotion.
Because they've been at it longer. Because they didn't have as much oil, and they just realized a lot earlier that what they needed to do was to create this balance of surface social liberalism and also carve out, it's very important, a carve out for expats from a lot of the laws that apply to locals, and also carve out expats from a lot of the laws that apply to menial labor. So they came up with a formula very early on because they needed to reposition their economy far earlier than Saudi needed to do that. And it's actually not even the entire UAE. It's essentially only Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and even Abu Dhabi kind of has just caught on really in the past 15, 20 years, I would say. It also has a slightly different, not to get too in the weeds, but it has a slightly different sort of clerical history. It has a sort of different relationship with its clergy, because it doesn't house the holy sites of Islam. And so there is a kind of slightly different relationship between the ruling parties or the ruling royal family and its religious establishment that kept Saudi back for a long time because they were trying to figure out that relationship, and ultimately figured it out by basically purging the clergy. So that's the only reason why the UAE gets away with it, because they had to do it earlier, quicker, and didn't have the sort of religious brakes on some of the quick accelerations of social liberalization that happened in the UAE that could not happen in Saudi. And even now, they're trying to do it quickly and actually are coming up against a bit of resistance. So that's the only distinction. But it'd be interesting, you know, the UAE may be also
a smaller population as well.
Yeah,
like
much
UAE is
smaller
much smaller. Yeah.
Much smaller, and the Emirates are kind of laws unto themselves. They didn't have to they did not do this as the United Arab Emirates. They did it as separate Emirates. So they have a different kind of social profile. However, the UAE is very close to Russia at the moment. There's lots of sort of Russian money laundering happening. Its sort of economic repositioning has ended up in a situation where it has slightly come out of the US's sort of orbit now, because it's just this pure play financial player. So I'm not quite sure if that's the model the US would like to be encouraging, but it's too late now.
Thanks, Nisreen. Barney, one for you. Amar asks, would you say that football sponsorships in general are ruining sports rather than just Saudi influence?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite convenient to blame all of the problems in the commodification and general kind of hideousness of global sport on a few states in the Gulf. I mean, that's kind of not really the way it's been or the way it is. I mean, Saudi's not responsible for this. This is simply a world that is very happy to take your money and to project you as much as you want. I mean, sports are a hideous, rapacious business with no borders, no regulation. We're talking about having a regulator in English football now, which will be a largely powerless, nominal position to make everybody sort of have a feeling there's a moral framework when clearly there isn't. No, I mean, sports is simply a megaphone and a mirror, and it gives you this kind of funfair reflection of these forces. And like I described earlier, the kind of cartoonish tableau of Putin and Mohammed bin Salman having a nice chat at a football match. But every day, the presence is there. I mean, you're talking about the way Abu Dhabi and Dubai did this all much earlier. I mean, I first went on to cover an England cricket tour in Abu Dhabi, I think in 2007, maybe in 2009. And we were so naive and didn't really know why we were there or why this was happening. I remember seeing a half-built Olympic city with Bangladeshi workers squatting in it in a sandstorm. This had been discontinued. They stopped building it. These people clearly had nowhere else to go. And having to actually ask, like, what's happening here? I don't understand what this is. And we were very naive about it. I mean, sport's been totally taken by surprise by this, and essentially, just keeps on blurting out the message. But there's no way you can blame that on a few small Gulf states. It's the US were doing the same in 1994, and the irony is the reason sport exists around the world is because the British used it as a sports washing implement in the Victorian age. I mean, it's kind of quite funny. Why does sport exist in Argentina? Why is cricket in India? It's because sport's a really useful way of going around the world and making people behave a certain way and projecting power. So, I mean, when we complain about it in this country, there is a slight reverse colonialism going on here, and it's kind of interesting in that sense. I mean, there are northern post-industrial cities being rejuvenated by the money that comes in, which is something the British government doesn't seem to be able to do. So it's a little more complex than that.
May I just add one thing? I think we can't get to the end of this without saying the word capitalism. I think it would be an abdication. I think one of the problems when it comes to having said all that we have said about Saudi and human rights abuses and moral abdication, etc., that one of the hypocrisies, or just to make it a bit milder, one of the sort of inconsistencies when we object to Saudi or Gulf sponsorship or purchasing of sports events or teams is that what you're calling for is regulation. What you're calling for is some sort of body, like you said, that can then determine who has the right to buy what is essentially a national asset, like a sovereign asset. You know, PGA golf is not just a sport; it's kind of a part of the American cultural hinterland. And that, I think, is the complication, is that, you know, if we are in the business of deciding what money is good enough or what money is permissible to purchase things that we arbitrarily decide are national assets that should not be bought by either, you know, hostile forces or compromised forces, then that opens up a whole can of worms about how we conduct our entire economic system in the West. And so it's not something I've got to the bottom of, because it's obviously not an easy thing to get to the bottom of, but it is a difficult position to take without appearing inconsistent or exceptionalist. As you just said, that there is a certain kind of colonial aspect to it. And then on top of that, there is a kind of economic naivete and protectionism aspect to it that ignores the fact that this is the system. Like, the system was created for capital to be mobile and to have low barriers, and for deals to be able to be created quickly, sometimes so quickly that even the actual participants in the sport are not aware that it's happening, because our global economic system, or our kind of transactional system, is so engineered and designed that these decisions are made at that level with such few barriers. So maybe the place to start is there, and not the sport aspect of it, which is kind of a lot lower downstream.
Thanks both. That was a very interesting answer. Patrick, Joanna Cornice is asking, what is the West's role in the Yemen war? Do you think that the war could last for so long if the US hadn't sold weapons to Saudi Arabia?
Well, they could have probably bought them somewhere else, actually. But there is a long-standing kind of arms relationship between America and also with the UK. So it's not just America. And actually, in the end, I mean, what I was trying to say earlier is I'm not sure actually the Saudi Arabian air campaign, I mean, that was brutal and killed a lot of people. I don't think it actually changed the reality on the ground, or if anything, it motivated more Houthis or gained more support for the Houthis rather than reduced it, because they were able to run a big anti-American campaign off the back of it. One of the infuriating things about the Biden administration was it said that they weren't going to allow any arms sales to Saudi Arabia for the war in Yemen, and I think it then changed it into a position where they weren't going to allow them to use any, give them any arms which could be used in an offensive capacity. And there's absolutely no way that they are able to check whether that's the case. And I also feel that the other point I make is that actually, I don't think we were just selling arms. I think the UK certainly was in Riyadh helping the Saudis to try and direct their bombing campaign. They were actually, certainly, if they were not actually involved in the targeting, they were certainly involved in the reviews after a bombing campaign. It wasn't just sales of arms. It was, we were administering the whole bombing campaign.
Thanks, Patrick. There's an interesting question here, which I'll sort of throw out there, which you've both sort of touched on, actually, Nesreen and Barney, in your previous answers, but I wonder if there's a broader point there. So Jenny Southern asks, is it xenophobic to boycott Saudi Arabia when so many other countries, such as the US and Italy, when it comes to LGBTQ plus rights, and countless others, are also undermining human rights?
Barney, do you want to get this?
Well, I mean, this is the problem that sport faces every day. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. Nobody knows the answer to that. It's a good point. I suppose you come down to a question of, do we have any absolutes here? Yeah, I mean, possibly you can say that, Italy is morally troubling, but does that really amount to exactly the same thing? Does the do we just draw the line anyway? I mean, I don't necessarily agree with your basic point, but yeah, just because one participant in these sports is not exactly what we've desired doesn't necessarily equate to. I mean, you're just disappear down a rabbit hole of moral relativism. Yeah, I mean, we heard this a lot with the England football team recently, who have tried very hard to take a stance on various moral issues and been really good on some of them. Like Gareth Southgate is a fantastic man compared to the way football normally talks about issues. He's so eloquent and he's so willing to engage with things, and he really understands his players, and he's really protected them, and they've actually educated him. He's listened to these young men who told him about their experiences, and you can see that he's really taken it on board. He protects them, and yet he now doesn't really want to talk about it because it's become too much for him. Jordan Henderson has gone to Saudi, who was an advocate of diversity and LGBTQ rights, and wore that cause like a rainbow-coloured coat, and has now whipped that off and decided that actually he wants to protect his family's economic future and go and play in Saudi Arabia. And Gareth Southgate isn't willing to talk about this, having been, the staunchest ally you could ever come across, because it's just impossible for him to process, and it doesn't leave him anywhere to stand, and he doesn't know what to say about it, because all of these things outflank you and are bigger than you. And he ends up, basically, he can't really function in that world anymore. If you want to make an absolute moral stance, then you can't really exist in that world. And Saudi has made a fool of Jordan Henderson and of Gareth Southgate. I mean, it's an incredible PR coup to have Jordan Henderson there saying, I'm so excited about this World Cup. The only person I've heard say anything sensible about this is Jill Scott, who's now retired, was a women's footballer for England, and Zara Pundit, who, when everybody was humming and hawing about what do we do about this? Is it good that Jordan's gone there? Said, well, I think it is good, because I'm a big Jordan Henderson fan. He's gone to a country where I can't go and watch him play anymore. Which was actually the bravest thing anybody in English football has actually said about this, because nobody knows how to deal with it, and we're all outflanked. But I don't think that we should give people a pass just because some people in other countries are also slightly morally compromised.
Thanks, Barney. Well, I think we've sort of reached the end of our time, unfortunately. So thank you very much, all four of you. Are there any closing comments you would like to make just before we wrap up? Now's your chance.
Yes, I'd like to make one. I very recently went to the Saudi embassy, where they had a briefing about human rights with their head of human rights. So the only point I'd make, a slight curveball point, is that they are aware that it's an issue. It may be just something to do with tourism. The conversation was ridiculous and pointless, but the very fact that they held the briefing, I thought, was really interesting.
Thanks, Patrick. Nesreen, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to pick up something Barney said. I spent a lot of time thinking about this ever since the Qatar World Cup. It takes up too much my brain capacity. But I think the problem is not the moral relativism. The problem is actually the moral complicity. And I think one of the ways in which we think about this is that Saudi as a moral entity is very separate to the US as a moral entity, or to Italy or France or the UK as a moral entity. And actually, Saudi is empowered and funded and armed by these other entities. And so, it's not about bad things other people have done and the grade, and which grade gives a pass and which grade is a fail, is that this is actually an ecosystem. And Saudi exists on one end of the scale, and without the complicity of countries that are now having to make judgments on whether Saudi is a savory or unsavory partner, they are on the other side of this of the spectrum of that. And so I think that has helped me think through it, that actually it's a false premise that it's just about different countries. It's actually a sort of a continuum of countries, and Saudi could not exist without them. So when they judge Saudi, they actually are judging, they should be judging themselves.
Thanks, Nesreen. That feels like a very good point to end our discussion on. So I want to say thank you very much to the panel for their time and their insights. Safa, Nesreen, Barney, Patrick, and thank you so much to you, the audience at home. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion and we've been able to answer some of your questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. All that's left for me to say now is that we'd really love to hear what you thought of this event. So do send over the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end. And for more events from Guardian Live, please do go to theguardian.live. Thank you again. Bye-bye.